plants, everything in nature. This intricate system of beliefs and principles has been kept for generations in the memories of elders, passed on in cabins and camps to those who listen, while cold wind whispers in the surrounding forest. This world was made by Dotsonsa, the great raven, in a time too distant to comprehend. Some of Dotsonsa's power endures in his descendants, who watch over his domain from the treetops and high hillsides. A Koyukon Indian hunter, seeing a raven overhead, may speak to it. Tsikath, old grandfather, bring us good luck. This is the ancestral home of the Koyukon Indians, who hunt, trap, fish, and live in this vast forest country near the Arctic Circle. There are 11 Koyukon settlements along the Yukon River and its largest tributary, the Kayukuk, in Alaska's northern interior. This program, and the ones to follow, will explore life in the Kayukuk River villages, especially the ways people live on the land and the relationships they keep with the natural world. The Koyukon belong to a family of peoples called Athabaskan, whose homeland stretches across the entire northwest quarter of our continent. Only the Eskimo, a separate people with a different cultural tradition, live farther north. This is the world Raven made. Here, nature is not governed by God, as in Christian tradition. Nature is God. Ancestors of the Koyukon have lived here for at least 10,000 years, yet the land is as beautiful and wild today as it was in the beginning. How have they touched their environment so that scarcely a trace of their presence can be seen in the wild land away from their villages? The traditional ways that Koyukon people behave toward their natural surroundings may provide the answer.
Everything, like moose head skin.
Yeah.
And that Johnny Ullman used to tell me that take that way off from the village, to haul it away, where there's nobody go around. That way you can keep your luck too.
This is a time of great change for the people of the Kayukuk River, as a new way of life develops. Snow machines, store-bought clothing, chainsaws, and canned goods are examples of this change. But the Koyukon keep a strong hold on many of their traditions while they choose to live in the 20th century. We can see what is modern, but we must watch and listen carefully to discover what is uniquely Koyukon.
Boy, it sure turned nice and warm, huh?
Yeah.
Boy, that's clear water. You can just see your snakes down there. I just can't catch the booger anyway. Depend on luck.
Yeah.
Pure luck.
Skill and knowledge are essential for the hunt, but equally important is a hunter's favor with the animals, his luck. Of the one who has good luck, the Koyukon people may say, something took care of him. Lakes and ponds dot the landscape of interior Alaska. They are home to the beaver and highway for the trapper who must travel long distances in his searches. Hunters cover these distances more quickly now than they did a few years ago when people relied on dogs. Alfred Atla is from Hughes, a village located about 200 miles northwest of Fairbanks, just below the Arctic Circle.
And you try to sit on each side of the feed pile, one side or the other.
Henry Williams is from Alakakit, a neighboring village 60 miles upriver.
Yeah, the big one come out first, after you make noise. He'll investigate, make sure the coast is clear. I'm not very lucky with beaver though, Henry. Once in a great while I get him. He come after this bait, he's supposed to. And when he does come after the bait, he bite it off right next to the ice. He come all the way up. That's when he's supposed to get caught.
And you put the bait right in the middle.
Right in the middle. I just hope I don't stick it into my snares. Put one way down, make sure you have a chance to see the damn thing.
Alfred Atla's son, Wayne. Like many of the younger Koyukon, he has attended school outside his village and is well educated in the white man's way. But he is also deeply interested in his own traditions, in learning the ways of his parents and grandparents. He has lived in the city, but now wishes to strengthen his ties to the village and to the surrounding homeland. In this stand of trees not far from Hughes, he cuts firewood, a vital resource where the deep cold of winter lasts for half the year.
I like living off the land, and I like living with my people. Right now, I'm just in the initial stages of learning our culture. I'm beginning to look at the land and the animals at a broader view. I'm learning from my grandpa, learning from my dad, and they're very important to me as my teachers. The culture and the land are intermingled. You can't really separate the culture, the land, and our people. It's not superstition, it's something that's evolved over thousands of years, that's been practiced from one generation to the next. You do something wrong to a wolverine, a wolf, or a lynx, if you don't treat them right and you don't respect them, you're not going to catch that animal for a while. It's not just a superstition, it's something that's true.
Like all creatures in Raven's world, the moose is more than just an animal. The Koyukon hunter watching a moose knows that he, too, is watched. But this is not a kind of seeing done with eyes. The hunter must be careful in what he says, because all animals can understand, even hushed words spoken far away in the village. Knowing this, a man preparing to hunt might say only that he's going out to look around. This way, the animals will not know of his plans, nor will he sound so proud as to be certain that he can find them. A young man like Wayne Atla has much to learn about the animals and how to hunt them. Among the first lessons the elders teach is that animals will give themselves only to people who treat them with respect. For the disrespectful hunter, it is as if the animals became invisible. Tracks may lead to emptiness, as if nothing had made them. For the respectful hunter, they may quickly lead to what he seeks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ina Nino, welcome again to our second session in Indigenous-led land use planning. Carrie Stevens Souza, Tribal Governance Faculty at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I am here on the beautiful lands of the Chinahutani, and again want to thank them for their stewardship for over 14,000 years in this area. It's a beautiful day here in the interior. Today we began with Make Prayers to the Raven, multiple part series that can be found on YouTube. And I very much always enjoy the series. It's a wonderful grounding. We like to begin every day with Indigenous voices, elders, songs. And this is something I often share at the beginning of our tribal governance classes to remind us of Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous ways of being, and knowledge, and sources of that knowledge. And so I just wanted to begin today with that to ground us. So I just want to say and encourage you to watch that full series. You can watch it on YouTube, and it's hosted by KUAC. And I'll share the link to that specific part of the series in the chat now for those of you that are able to see it. Again, we had an amazing first day, and very much want to honor and thank all of our partners in this work that made this series possible. And our opening guest lecturers, our Indigenous experts, Wilson Justin, Darcy Peter, and Makamantor Paki. And hopefully all of you are receiving your course updates from Hannah Marie, who's keeping us all organized in line. So a big bossy out to Hannah Marie as well for keeping us all up to date. The course recording is shared in the email if you weren't able to join with us in the first session. So with that, I just want to go over a flow for today in our time. Our 2.5 hours goes very, very quickly. And again, we want to allow time for you to have your breakouts, dialogues, and sharing. Very quickly, as we start, I'd like to open up for a few voices, a couple of reflections from our first time together on Tuesday. And then I'm going to do a very brief overview of the context here within Alaska, within which we're operating in land use planning. And so I'll kind of breeze through that to make time for our Indigenous guest lecturer and speaker, Freddie Olin. So we're very grateful for his sharing with us today. And then we'll launch right into breakout sessions and hopefully have time for a debrief again. So our 2.5 hours goes very quickly. So with that, I really would like to open up to any sharing, any brief reflections again, remembering our guiding principles, the First Alaskans agreements that guide our time together, to be respectful of one another's time, but this to be a safe space for real sharing and real learning as we push into these boundaries. And we'll be talking a lot about boundaries today. So if you are able to use the hand raise feature, that always very much helps for us to be able to make space for you to share your voice. So if anybody had a reflection of something that really sat with them on Tuesday that you would like to share with everyone online, we're currently at 93 participants. So again, Ina, Nino, and welcome everybody to our space. Anyone want to offer up any reflections from Tuesday? And if everybody could remember to, I don't like to mute anyone, so that you can speak when you're able, and just to limit our background noise to please make sure everyone's muted. And I see Michelle really appreciated her time in the breakout groups to converse. And so also feel free to always put any reflections or sharing in the chat as well. Just checking my screen for any reflections and sharing in your voices in the room. Thank you, Leanna. See you there.
Hi. I wanted to wait and see if others wanted to chime in first. So hi everyone, I'm Leanna Hefner. I'm with the Northwest Boreal Partnership. We're a conservation partnership among many diverse groups in Alaska and Canada. And I've been working in this space for the last 5 years. I started out as a research scientist once upon a time, and have been in this space of, working in conservation, working with folks in government agencies and with tribes and First Nations and nonprofit conservation organizations, academia. And, when we come together in this space to learn and share, I think it's important to recognize that this can bring up a lot for different people, including many feelings of discomfort. And we heard some of that echoed by some of the participants who were attending on Tuesday. I'm one of the course organizers, by the way. And in other courses and other series that I've helped to organize that really elevate Indigenous voices, we've also encountered some of the same kind of trying to reconcile what's coming up, particularly for our non-Indigenous and white participants in these dialogues, as we're hearing from Indigenous folks who are talking about, their perspectives on the way that lands have been managed around conservation issues, land ownership and stewardship, a whole host of things. And so I wanted to, and I'm borrowing these words from my dear friend and colleague, Danielle Stickman. If you're feeling uncomfortable, sit with it. And it's okay. It's actually a good thing if discomfort is coming up. But sit with it and then maybe invite in some exploration of why are you feeling uncomfortable? What could be behind that? Because we're unpacking decades of, and really even hundreds of years of a lot of trauma and conflict, inequities, and having a system in place now that is based in, colonialism, and really having a dominant worldview be in place that comes from, a Euro-Western background. And so I think for those of us, especially, I used to work in the federal government for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I work with, a nonprofit conservation organization. sometimes those feelings can feel very personal to us. I speak as a white person working in this space and a scientist, but just to remind us that, you know, this is speaking to really a system that's in place that we currently have, and exploring the ways that we want to and need to change this system and move towards a place where there's more equity, where we are supporting, you know, Indigenous leadership and voices, but that this is really a communal effort. And so it's really an inviting in. And I know that our speakers and those who have organized this are coming from a place of pushing against the kind of what has been this dominant system in place, but also it's a welcoming in for all of us to do this work together. So I just wanted to put that out there, and hopefully that feels helpful. And also we really invite dialogue that can go deeper into how this may affect you personally, and then how we bring that to our work, and to think about what is the role that we have in our work that's either kind of keeping that dominant system that's been in place for so long, keeping it going, and what are maybe the ways in which we can start to change things to come to that place of equity and a shared vision. Thank you for letting me speak, Carrie.
Yes, Basi, Leanna, I think that that's a very important reminder as we begin today. And we should be uncomfortable in many of the spaces we encounter today in our place, as I feel we have a new era, a new time upon us with the recognition of the historical trauma, and that we remember the systems, the systemic racism, the systemic genocide that have shaped these systems that we're discussing today. And that land use and land use planning is guided by governance and governance by governments. And so there are a lot of pieces that hopefully do emerge and will emerge over time, because while we are skimming the treetops, which I said many times over the first session, and will today, as I ramble quickly through some history to make as much time for Freddie as possible, is that there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of history that impacts the work that we do. And I remember sitting around a table in tribal natural resources management, and every single tribal leader at that table had lost a child, had had great loss and great impacts, and they were showing up to the work. And this very much is the work of land use planning in Alaska. We come as whole individuals to this work. So always wanted to acknowledge that space, acknowledge who's not with us in the room today, and bring them along with us as well. Those that are living on the street to those that have passed. We do this for all of them, and all Alaskans, so, and Canadians. And hello to all of our First Nations relatives and friends on the line as well. I also really appreciate all of the comments that are coming through in the chat. Is very appreciative. I see them from Lauren and Donna and Ariane and Hannah Marie as well. So very much appreciate that. So I don't see anybody's burning hand up. So I'm going to jump in again, wanting to make as much time as possible for Freddie to share. I tend to be all over the place. And I do want to say, if something is really burning and not making sense, it seems uncomfortable, it seems disrespectful, but please interrupt. Please also put notes in the chat, something we can come back to and address, or I can try to address while I'm speaking. So I'm going to do a screen share, and this will be shared out as well with our group after today's session as well as the few slides that were shared on Tuesday. Okay. I'm really appreciating the comments. So I want to jump in again to make sure we have time for dialogue. So hopefully everyone can see the shared screen. Is everybody seeing that okay?
Coming through clear.
All right. So I am going to, as one of our students shared once, talk as fast as a Fed and go through this again quite quickly, that we can have as much time as possible. So one thing that's really important, I feel that we're doing in our time together in this course is breaking trail. We're doing something new, something that really hasn't been done before across Alaska and Canada and really the globe. And that is really grounding ourselves in Indigenous self-governance, in Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and recognizing the colonization, the fragmentation, and the disenfranchisement of Indigenous peoples in their own homelands. I'm going to go through a little bit of an abbreviated legal framework, a little bit of an abbreviated review of land management and planning policies. Again, I'll be this very brief that it should make you want to dive deeper into all of these topics. And there are a lot of links that are provided throughout the document so you can all dig deeper. So this is the trail that we're breaking together through this series and in our work. As we know, in Alaska, I'll be focusing on Alaska today, that we are on native land, that this is an Indigenous place. And, you know, the name Alaska derives from Indigenous languages. And so this is one of the best representations that we have. And this is the language map across Alaska, but really we don't have an adequate reflection, a mapping of the traditional territories of Alaska. But what we do know is that these are Indigenous landscapes, and there was an intimate and continues to be a very intimate relationship with place. And there are many, many resources that a few of which I've named here. This is through aloka-arctic.org, also the Alaska Native Knowledge Network, where we see place names documented, Indigenous place names documented. And what do they tell us? Again, they tell us these are Indigenous landscapes. And for every turn in the river, for every lake, for every portage, for every peak, there is an Indigenous place name. We need to remember that people walked this place. Shonda is also another awesome story of a Gwich'in grandmother. She lived to be over 126 years old, who walked her place, walked this earth. And so we see many, many traditional place name projects that have occurred across Alaska and of course across Canada. And so this is the perspective. There are no boundaries. There are no borders. And I see those questions in the chat. Yes, absolutely. This PowerPoint will be shared with all of you. You see no boundaries, you see no borders, but you see a landscape covered with intimate relationship and place names. And how does this translate? As we see in 1999, this is from the Stevens Village Land Use Plan, just an excerpt of their Indigenous place names across their place, Dini Hutana Nena, and that is the place of the people of the canyon. And we see their dedication, the dedication of their land use plan to the ancestors. This is who we dedicate our time to and all of the land stewardship in Alaska. We also want to recognize that there was active, intimate stewardship of place. Paul Anaguk said that it was quite shocking when people came to this place that were not from here, that anyone existed on the landscape because the landscape was so untouched. And it's important to remember that there was active management, active stewardship, active relationship with place. And so this is from Bridging Yesterday with Tomorrow, which is one of the links for today, and a representation that living your culture is a living in relationship, in stewardship with place. And a critical element to Indigenous-led land use planning, to any Indigenous approaches to stewardship of place, is a recognition that living in relationship with this place is what has created the essentials of the social, cultural, spiritual, physical, and economic well-being of the Indigenous people of this place. And this is not anything that we need to debate. This is documented in multiple legal frameworks, including ANILCA, okay? And so this whole needing to continuously repeat this statement is unnecessary. This is a given. This is a known. And so we have this intimate stewardship, this place. And then what occurs is colonization and nation and state governance. There were reservations in Alaska, but then we had statehood and the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. I'm going to briefly touch on some aspects of that and some of those implications, but Freddie will really be diving into that more today as well. And ANILCA, which is one thing that really impacts our land use. I want to recognize that I'm not covering a vast majority of legal issues. I'm very much in a very brief format, presenting a very brief framework of where we are in relation to Indigenous-led stewardship in Alaska today. So we have traditional territories. This is our foundation. And today we have boundaries, we have fragmentation, and we have land ownership, land management. Again, not based in relationship, reciprocity, redistribution, and responsibility. This is, you can find at the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, Division of Forestry. But if you just Google who owns, manages Alaska.
You just cut me off at the light. You're lucky I don't get out of this truck and open the gate.
I think we need to mute maybe participant. So what is really important and really unique about Alaska, which of course is founded in ANILCA and ANCSA, which we'll come up to, is that Alaska is unique in that over 60% of Alaska is owned by the United States government and managed by the United States government. So here in representation, we see US governmental lands in tans and greens. State of Alaska is in blue, and privately held lands are in kind of that orange tone, ANCSA, and non-ANCSA in red, which we really see around our urban centers. One thing this map should do for us is recognize that this entire map is Indigenous land, and that dispossession through ANCSA down to these very small blocks of land. So what we see are these models of land ownership and jurisdiction across Alaska today. This is one example of land ownership, with the green being refuges and the blocks being village and regional corporation lands. And so we also are seeing BLM lands here. So really what we have seen is going from holistic Indigenous perspectives of land stewardship, okay, is this fragmented, multi-jurisdictional to land ownership, as we see here in the Atna region. So we see a mapping of fishing sites along the Copper River, which is now turned into a matrix of land ownership between the Bureau of Land Management, the wildlife refuges, national parks, national preserves, and Alaska Native lands through ANCSA. We see jurisdictions in fish and game management through GMUs and game management units. And this is just one example of how land stewardship is chopped up into a variety of blocks. And this is the local advisory committee's map from the state of Alaska. How the state comes to natural resources management, and this is just one piece to paint the picture through statehood, is through Article 8 of the state constitution, that there is a common use, sustained yield, and equal access clause, that all Alaskans have equal rights to the resources of Alaska. And that is important to very much understand where the state of Alaska is coming from in their management of resources. And notice that it is for the maximum benefit of the people. Again, how is that defined? The maximum benefit of the people here is defined by a Western government in Western terms. So of course, next we have ANCSA. And one of the important pieces of ANCSA, which Freddie will talk about more, is the extinguishment to all title and claim and by Alaska's Native peoples, and using federal and international law. They made sure they touched all their bases based on use, occupancy, right, title, treaty, foreign laws, and conveyances to land, water, and including any Aboriginal hunting or fishing rights that may exist. One point that is important to note here for us is that Robert Anderson, who is now counsel at the Department of Interior, wrote many legal briefs on hunting and fishing rights. He often writes that this is a purported extinguishment of Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights, because by international law, they were not compensated for. Only land loss was compensated for. At this time, I apologize, I'm breezing through. I want to wrap up in a few minutes here. There is a congressional promise made at the passage of ANCSA that the Secretary and the state take any action necessary to protect the subsistence needs of Alaskan Natives. And so from that, ANILCA does many things. The Alaska National Interest Land Conservation Act of 1980, of course, established all these federal public lands across Alaska. Denali was in existence, but it was expanded through ANILCA, and all of the other conservation units were created at that time. But one of the important things that it did was it recognized that the traditional way of life was necessary to Native existence. And what is very interesting as well is that it states that this should continue to occur on federal public lands and on Native land. However, what we see following the McDowell decision and the state of Alaska saying ANILCA goes against the Constitution, the courts, I should say, the Supreme Court of Alaska, we see dual management in Alaska in fish and wildlife management. And so we see the federal government really having that jurisdictional authority over federal public lands. And the state of Alaska has that jurisdictional authority over state lands, but also privately held lands, which include Alaska Native regional and village corporation lands. Okay, so they are held in fee simple title, and they are subject to state jurisdiction and state law. But one thing that's important to recognize in the context of Alaska is that we have three sovereigns. We have the federal government and the state government and tribal governments. Okay, and where is the third sovereign in this equation? Okay. So that is important to recognize. So what we see here is another series of borders and boundaries that apply to land use planning and land use management. And these are the regional advisory councils, a very different grouping than state ACs, as we see here. Again, with the GMUs, the game management units, chopped up here. It's important to recognize, as was taught to me by Elder Wilson Justin, how are these GMUs created? It's important to ask ourselves, how did these boundaries become where they are today? And that was for Western purposes of conservation. ANCSA lands were chosen largely due to subsistence resources, and GMUs were formed because of guiding and the commercialization of fish and wildlife resources in Alaska. So as we move forward to planning, it's really important that we understand the decision-making bodies in these planning systems, the authority and rules of these planning bodies, their processes, and the timing, and understanding the decision makers. So I'm just going to wrap up with the second half of the slides here to talk about this very briefly, that when it comes to land management and land planning policies, we have so many actors, and they're not all included here. But within the Indigenous community, of course, there are tribal governments, there are co-management boards, but of course also village and regional corporations, very different across every portion of Alaska. And as we know, it's very important to point out that the regional corporations hold all of the subsurface rights in their region, including for the village and the regional corporations that were created under ANCSA. Then we have multitude of bodies weighing in on the federal government. This isn't even all of them. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, Park Service, BLM, BIA, and USDA. And of course, DNR, DEC, ADF&G, Department of Commerce, and more in Alaska. This is an unwieldy matrix as we work to move forward in land use planning. Within the state of Alaska, this is the link to their land planning policies and systems. So I really encourage you to dig through that. We certainly don't have time today to dig through all of that. So I wanted to give you that resource. But what's really important is in the state of Alaska, land use plans, state natural resource regulations require the inclusion of any local land use plan in decision making. Then, of course, we have the Fish and Wildlife Service and refuges. And refuges have a very unique mission. They have comprehensive conservation plans. They're supposed to occur every 15 years, the vast majority of which in Alaska are not meeting those qualifications and not having their comprehensive conservation plans updated every 15 years. But what are their plans really working towards? They're working towards the conservation, management, and where appropriate, restoration of fish, wildlife, and plant resources and their habitats. Very different from the Park Service, whose policy and philosophy is really to draw a boundary around a piece of land and preserve that, quote, unimpaired. The refuge does see humans as part of that environment, recognizes subsistence. The Park Service is of course changing over time, but really sees it as a static preservation that needs to be put in place. So it's really important to recognize the missions driving these planning documents and policies of these federal agencies. All of Southeast is dominated by the Forest Service, which is now the quote unquote landowner of the traditional territories of the Tlingit and Haida. And they are really managing towards multiple use, restoration, water, recreation, and of course, economic development. And we know that the roadless rule and the Forest Service is a good example of the unique situation here in Alaska. The BLM, again, divides up the state into multiple planning areas, as we see here, and they go through their planning processes for each of these areas, which are cross over multiple traditional territories. So one tribe may need to participate in multiple plan efforts. So you can see if you're from, let's just pick Fort Yukon, you've got to participate in multiple refuge planning processes, multiple BLM planning processes, and you don't even have funded tribal natural resources staff. Are you tired? Because I'm tired. The jurisdictional issue and chopping up of all of these multiple plans. This is an example of the East Alaska planning area and planning process for BLM. How are you supposed to engage in all of these EISs, all of these RMPs for all of these federal public agencies, let alone the state as a tribal government? Then, of course, this is one example of Alaska Native Corporation, their mission, their vision, and what they are managing their lands towards. So in closing, where are we going? This is one model that I love to highlight from the Atna region in tribal stewardship planning. It's very unique in that it's groundbreaking for its comprehensive, unified approach. They are approaching it from a traditional territory approach. Again, they're not saying we're not going to do our plan for right here because this is a BLM box. It is a unified approach in that it includes the village tribal governments. They have a very different model with their SVOs as a part of their ATNA incorporated organization here, their ANC, and they have one Chitna Corp here. So they're coming together in unity to create a comprehensive land use plan. And one thing that's very important, as we went through the planning process, the thing they wanted to really impact in their planning process was self-governance and sovereignty and hunting and fishing regulations. You can see how large that was, okay? And this blew our heads off. Faye Ewan there on the left, they said, we're not doing land use planning by anyone else's parameters. We're doing them by clan system use. Wilson discussed this at large. Of course, this is his region, that this is work we did in land use planning. And they said, we are mapping our clan system use of our territory. And that's what you see here. And merging that with the ATNA incorporated land use designations for their area. So again, a very unified and integrated planning process between tribes and their ANC. And this really stands to benefit the community, the people, the place, all of us. They're bringing all of us with them in enhancing their self-governance, protecting their cultural resources, their economic security, their social well-being, but also using this as a tool to build their stewardship program. I'm seeing some of the comments in the chat, and I will end here. This is one of the amazing resources in the Alaska Native Knowledge Network, which is included in this link. The ownership of the land has been broken into many small pieces, but the land itself is not broken into pieces. And the villager's use of the land cannot be broken into pieces if his way of life is to continue. And this comes from a document, Does One Way of Life Need to Die for Another to Survive?, which is also listed on the syllabus for the course. So I do want to apologize for talking so fast that your heads are spinning, but I wanted to give you a brief overview of lands, policy, and management across Alaska. And I wanted to hand, excuse me, hand it off to Freddie so that we have some time to talk and debrief after. So Freddie, I hope that that was a good introduction to what you're going to share today. I'm a little nerve-wracked to cover all of these things for all of you in a short period of time, but wanted to provide a few resources and a context. Anabasi, Freddie, and I'll hand it off to you, and I'll kind of catch up in the chat a bit as well with my ADHD self. Anabasi, Freddie.
Thank you, Professor Stevens. I hope everyone can hear me okay.
Yes, and we can see your screen wonderfully.
Perfect. And thanks for the great introduction. I'm about to ready to run out the door and tell people how to fix land management in Alaska. That was a great introduction. I'd like to introduce myself really briefly. My name is Freddie Olin. I am tribally enrolled with the native village of Tanana on the Middle Yukon. My wife, Anoke Olin, is from Shishmaref, and we have our son there, Das. It means sandhill crane in Danaka, or Koyukon Athabaskan. And we have a another little baby on the way there. You can see a note kind of holding her baby bump later this summer. So I just finished making the first presentation on my undergraduate thesis through the UIF Rural Development Department. Yesterday, I actually finished the undergrad thesis last spring, but my wife was busy with her own master's program, so I had to take a break to watch our son while she got her master's degree. So I'm just continuing to ride this couple days of speaking engagements here. Really appreciate the opportunity to share my ideas and work with this class cohort, and I will share this presentation with everybody, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to contact me. There will be my emails on the last slide here. So I've been working on these ideas of how ANCSA as a public law and Native corporations as chartered state entities with the state of Alaska to consider climate change as a serious endeavor, mostly focused on adaptation. There's mitigation and some other formats concerning how humans can address climate change, but I think in the case for Alaska, adaptation is the most appropriate method. And the Arctic report card that was most recently issued when I was drafting my thesis was from 2020. It was released December 2020, published by the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. An almost poetic quote here: the sustained transformation to a warmer, less frozen, and biologically changed Arctic remains clear. So the catchphrase, of course, is climate change, but I think climate changed might be the more accurate snapshot. Here's a brief overview of Alaska Native corporations. Alaska Native corporations are landowners, and a multitude of shareholders collectively own and manage these lands. There are, as of a December 2020 count, 181 Alaska Native corporations. 12 of them are regional corporations, and 170 something are village corporations. I'm not the greatest at math here, but in the latest 2020 census counting, tabulated something over 120,000 Alaska Native peoples who identify as Alaska Native in one way or another throughout the state. And the collective ownership is just over 44 million acres of land statewide. And the most often or frequent or prevalent land use is subsistence, which is a really important centerpiece of my study here. The methodology concerned an online survey, which I held open for exactly 1 calendar month, 30 days, and I received a number of 60 responses from shareholders, from Alaska Native Corporation staff or leadership, and several members of boards of directors of Native corporations. Even though I kept responses anonymous in published formats, I kept close track of who participated in the survey, and as far as I could determine, everyone was in fact Alaska Native, and everyone was in fact tied somehow to an Alaska Native corporation. But continuing on to the findings here, which are almost anticlimactic, is that from what I found through the survey, no Native corporation is taking active measures to adapt to climate change. It's not that exciting. It's not that it's not that it's not the best thing to share. but that's how research starts. That's how research is helpful for people to advance knowledge. So my idea here is to continue sharing what I learned through the survey, sharing the survey with other folks so that we can continue building upon this starting point and be able to work through our Native corporations, work with Native corporations to become more active in climate change adaptation on these 44 million acres of land throughout the state. And even though none of the answers indicated climate adaptation, many of the respondents did have descriptions of how they have seen climate change over the course of the past several decades. You can see a response here from an anonymous respondent from question 8. And I'm sure a lot of folks on the call here have made their own observations about how climate change is affecting their lives or affecting their homelands or home communities. And it's something that we all know is happening. Here's a quick description of climate change, common climate change events in Alaska: erosion, flooding, permafrost thaw or subsidence, invasive plant and animal species, and expanded or reduced fish and game habitat. There's a quick delineation between permafrost thaw, which would entail a complete thawing event, and permafrost subsidence, which entails a reduced permafrost size or volume, but not completely thawed. So that's an important aspect to consider, especially for the interior, where a lot of ecosystem feedback, I guess, relies on a continued presence of permafrost. That's something that I think about quite often. But continuing on. So as I worked through conducting the survey, analyzing the survey, and correlating the survey with my ideas, and communicating and networking with my professional and personal network of folks involved in the Native corporation world and community, climate change has already affected our Alaskan Native subsistence way of life and will continue to impact our Alaskan Native subsistence ways of life. And as I work through my ideas and make these presentations, my main message to convey is that climate change is putting this way of life at stake, and it's something that I go to bed thinking about every night. But before I go on to a very different part of the presentation and my research, I would like to open it up to any questions, comments, counter arguments, anything really. I see one comment here. Stroll. Without anything popping up, I will continue the presentation, which is a comparison really of what state and federal agencies have done to take climate change as a serious endeavor, and how Native corporations could adopt similar programs to use tomorrow, really. So the first program comparison is the State of Alaska Climate Impact Mitigation Program. It's a relatively small program compared to the whole state budget, but it does have a major success, with the relocation from Newtok to Matarvik. Apologies if I'm not pronouncing it correctly. But it's a major success because Retarvik is 7 miles up the river from the old site of Newtalk. And Retarvik has adequate and safe and healthy housing with water and sewer, power, electricity, heat. And that's a really huge success. It's easy to say that they've done it on paper, but I'm sure reality was very, very different, and it was challenging on a daily basis. But I do know that the Alaska Climate Impact Mitigation Program works with a variety of villages, mostly on the west coast, western Alaska coastline, for villages that need the most help and technical assistance with climate change adaptation, mitigation, and even relocation. The next program is the Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Climate Resilience Program. It's gone through a number of different name changes over the years, but it has been a functioning program since 2011. And since that year through 2021, the last reported year while I was drafting my thesis, was that $21 million of funding has been awarded to Alaska tribal governments under this program. And I've hand-built a spreadsheet, including information for each award and each tribe and each planned activity, hoping that someone soon down the road can conduct a report on all of these adaptation awards and be able to share it with tribal governments who would be interested in this program in the near future. And the third program here is the Denali Commission Village Infrastructure Protection Program. I was involved with the very start of this work back in 2015, 2016, when I was working in the Walker Malott administration. I was staff in Byron Malott's state co-chairmanship of the Denali Commission. And what we did was coordinate a state executive response, so to speak, of how state government agencies and programs could assist with village relocation and infrastructure protection programs statewide, which is really exciting. And what was the result of this work was the 2019 statewide threat assessment report, which found at least 90 rural villages around the state are under immediate need for adaptation planning or relocation. When we started the work and started this assessment or prioritization list, it was really difficult, it was really complex. Each village has its own unique circumstance, and it's not so easy just to say, oh, Kivalina is the #1 priority. Each village has its own circumstance and its own needs. And it was really difficult to come up with a list like this from Juneau or Anchorage or Fairbanks. The Denali Commission, I know, really worked with villages around the state to learn what each village needed to produce this report. And it took several years for it to be completed. And to the conclusion or closing of my presentation here, now that I'm actually working for an Alaska Native Corporation and Gunnew Limited, I'm learning firsthand or comparing firsthand what my studies found and what needs to be done today, really for a Native corporation like Gunnew to do and adaptation planning and adaptation activities. Digital mapping is the first need. When I first started working on my ideas in 2018, digital mapping was something I never considered, but now that I'm actually here at Gunnew Limited, like nobody's ever nobody at Gunnew has fully utilized programs and platforms that are out there to produce digital maps and use digital maps for land management. ArcGIS, I think, is the most used platform by professionals, but there are other less technical programs like Google Earth or Google Maps. I think there's even some apps on devices that can be used for digital mapping that are connected to GPS services. And from digital mapping, making land use designations like the Ahtna stewardship plan has done. I think that that's another major starting point that Native corporations can do, is coming up with a coherent land use designation glossary, so to speak, and coming up with certain areas like subsistence areas, habitat areas, conservation, development that are in concert with State of Alaska and Federal Land Management Agency definitions. And from mapping and from coming up with land use designations is finding the areas that are most environmentally vulnerable. That's a mouthful, but it's something that agency staff always use. So you can learn where shareholders are using corporation lands and correlating climate projection data, learning that, such an area for berry picking is likely to be flooded in 20 years due to sea level rise, or just, an example like that. And also learning where public infrastructure is most vulnerable, like electricity or heating, safe housing, and safe public transportation, whether it's terrestrial or over water, or during the winter over ice. Just learning where these types of areas and these types of uses and these types of dwellings are most at threat to climate change impacts now and into the near future. Everyone hears reports of how dire the situation is. 10 years from now, the sea level is going to rise 3 meters, which is going to be catastrophic. And so it's really important just to take that data seriously when you're looking at these types of areas as landowners, whether it's Native corporations, whether it's tribes, whether it's First Nations, whether it's even non-native governments like municipalities or boroughs or the state and federal government. But going back to rural Alaskan Native villages, having cooperative, collaborative, and goodwill teamwork between local leadership is probably the most important piece to have in place for a successful climate adaptation program. We all hear stories about how a tribe doesn't like the village corporation, or how the village corporation doesn't like the city. That to have a successful adaptation program in place, none of that can be happening. Each entity has to be working closely together for a community to have a successful adaptation program. I've seen examples of where there's an MOU or MOA in place between each entity, between the city, between the village corporation, between the tribe, and they meet quarterly to discuss about how such a community can advance its interests and advance its development now and into the future. And I think that's a really great example that could be used statewide. I mean, each village could have this type of steering committee between each entity, and you know, and that's something that I'll continue to share until I see it happening. So as I mentioned, here's my contact information. I'm putting my thesis into practice through Gun U Limited. My dad's an original shareholder through Galena, and my mother has inherited Gun U Limited stock from her paternal side in Mulatto. Who knows? I could become a shareholder, and my wife and our future children could become shareholders as well. So it's definitely a project that will continue for several generations. I think that's all I had to share. Carrie, if you'd like to take the floor again.
Yes, Anabasi, Freddie. I love this work. I love this very unique perspective that you have there, Gun-U, and the energy that's happening and developing throughout ANCs across the state in this work, and all of the young leaders like yourself, and having your voice in the room is very energizing for me. I see our chat is just blowing up, and that is very exciting as well. So hopefully you can circle back to that, Freddie, and see some of the comments and questions there as well. And this, I want to speak a little bit to this dispossession of people from their place, and this artificial division, you know, created through ANCs and tribal governments. We didn't really focus on that wholly, but that in the work of land use planning, this is a challenge at the local level in many cases, and at the tribal level and the ANC level, of being able to utilize those resources in a unified manner. And one thing I put in the chat that I wanted to make very clear is that through these models of land ownership and jurisdiction that create this multitude of planning policies and planning efforts, tribal governments, ANCs, Indigenous peoples, communities are often an afterthought, are often an anecdotal piece, are often criminalized, arrested, fined, ticketed in their homelands. Survival Denied shares a lot of those stories, and are often even referred to as inholders. I don't know if many of you have used that term or heard of that term, but it's quite offensive to someone in their homeland to be referenced as an inholder, a stakeholder, or even a stranger in their homeland. So these are things that we always hear when we're in the work. And I'm definitely going to quote Freddie in his work about climate change. I love that, and always am picking up my favorite quotes from people. So again, Anabasi, Freddie, and before we head into our breakout groups, which is awesome, our chat is blowing up. I wanted to make sure if there are any direct Q&A with Freddie or anything in the chat we want to address before we move to our breakout groups. I just want to give that time because it's really, really a lot of dialogue happening. So was there any question for Freddie at this time? Wanted to make sure that, or comments?
I have a question. Hopefully that might give others time to think. Freddie, it's so interesting to me about Native corporations is they're Indigenous led, but also the creation of the corporations is based in a, the idea of a corporation came from a very Western system and perspective around capitalism and the corporations having land ownership, and in ways that also is tied to how to bring in profits, and that the corporations were kind of set up, and they're very diverse. So I hope I'm not generalizing. In every corporation has a very different approach and value system. And on Tuesday, I know you weren't able to make that discussion, but when we heard from Wilson and Maka and Darcy about Indigenous worldviews, we heard some interesting points about, say, like Maka mentioned, we don't manage the land manages us. Wilson brought up the ways in which, in the very traditional ways of thinking about land, the term planning is actually asynchronous with, from his people's, the traditional ways of thinking of lands, because planning is really something that's left up to the creator. Darcy spoke to kind of this vision of being more in relationship with the land, as opposed to just talking about climbing a mountain and not conquering it. So I'm just curious, like, what are your own personal thoughts on the ways in which there's sometimes a struggle with the Native corporations around sort of this original intent to generate profits and funds that go to shareholders, and also having to operate deeply within this Western system of land planning, land ownership, how that connects to the very real needs around climate adaptation and other community needs, along with traditional ways, Indigenous worldview, and sort of how you see corporations evolving and moving forward in that kind of tension.
Yeah, thanks, Leanna. I have to be subjective here and fall back on my life experiences. I started out when I was younger. I started on the slope, working on drilling rigs, and then I transitioned to firefighting. I was a professional wildland firefighter for 3 seasons, and then I transitioned once again to the state capitol. I worked in the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. And while I was there, I saw firsthand that how political movements stall. Just even being able to think about climate change or consider climate change as an issue. And so this is when I began thinking about how Alaska Natives, through whatever methods, whether it's through tribal governance, whether it's through Alaska Native corporations, or whether it's just as individuals acting on their own, we have the inherent power through tribes, through Native corporations, through our own activities to plan and adapt to climate change. Tribes, it's been described legally that tribes are sovereigns without territorial reach, meaning that tribes are sovereign governments, but it's the Native corporations that are the major landowners in the state. And so this is how I arrived at my thesis. I was like, Native corporations, whether I agree with, drilling, whether I agree with, development per se, this platform, this channel is here for us Alaska Natives to use to actively adapt to climate change as the landowners. And that being said, we can do it without the state government. We can do it without the federal government. We can do it without major producers of oil and gas. Like this opportunity is here. This opportunity as shareholders of these corporations. It's an opportunity that a person like myself can take hold of and grab and move forward with. So that's how I arrived to this thesis. That's how I arrived to my ideas. And it's always debatable. There's always going to be a debate about development, conservation, whatever, whether or not climate change is even real. But that's honestly, those are conversations that I've just stopped listening to. I want to take action now, and whether it's through a tribe or a corporation, this work needs to be done.
Anabasi. Again, the focus that Freddie is sharing around, climate change, and still this priority of land use around subsistence and traditional ways of life is this unifying theme. And as you can see, it's really the way in which I have framed so much of my work, and why I come from that perspective, because I think that's what I was taught by Freddie and all of his colleagues and family and peoples, that that's where my heart was driven. I didn't share that when I first moved here, I lived in Vashranko, Arctic Village, and in Gwich'aghé, Fort Yukon. And so very intimately tied to multiple land ownerships and jurisdictions. And so, but this was always the driving force. And so I just want to acknowledge that. I come to that from this perspective. And, I was deleting my 100 of slides on fish and wildlife regulatory realms to focus more on the planning piece. But it is this constant driving force, as Freddie shared in his work, and a force that propels me forward. I just want to check in any other questions or comments before Hannah Marie is just finishing up on the breakout groups, and we have a couple questions for you. We want to make sure that, and I'm just looking for hands raised or people waving, wanting to comment. I want to make sure I make space for that. And again, I love the chat going off and all of the information and content that's been shared there as well. I just want to remind you, as Hannah finishes up the breakout groups and as we pose the question, to really encourage that dialogue. What we heard yesterday is some breakout rooms were really, really busy and rife with dialogue, and some were a little more quiet. But just that there are no wrong answers, that these are safe spaces. And this is why we build so much dialogue time into our class together. We'll put these ideas in front of you, and really there are so many amazing individuals on the line that this is your time to kind of coalesce and come up with solutions together and paths forward, or ask questions of one another. You're all very diverse. So we're learning together. So that's really important to us. Okay. And I'm loving the comments, and I'm always learning as well. I learned so much from Freddie. Freddie, I just want to check in with you. Did you have any comments or any other thoughts you wanted to share?
I don't think so, Professor Stevens. I'm just chatting with a few folks here.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. I love it. These dialogues, these connections, and this space is also what we're fully about. So I'm going to put the question in. Oh, Donna. Yes, I see you. Hi, Donna.
Do you guys hear me okay? Hi.
Yes, good to see you, Donna.
Okay, nice to see you. I think the last time I saw Professor Stevens was at a Beyonce concert in Seattle before the pandemic, so just have to say that. Anyways, I think one really resourceful opportunity, which is interesting that I'm, participating electively in this course, which is phenomenal, is a week-long class and series about the ANILCA provision that's sponsored by the Institute of the North, and Hannah Eklund, I think, coordinates that for the Institute of the North, and it's been really eye-opening about the complexities, because, as Freddie would say, yes, as tribal governments, they have like more of a political breadth, but they don't really have like a land holding. But it's confusing, I think, as anxious shareholders or, afterborns, if you will, to really understand the maps that Carrie shared, as well as even the perspectives of various regions on development versus not development. And I just think it's a really important point when you're looking at federal code or the Alaska Constitution or the intricacies of sections of ANILCA that are essentially challenged, contested, can be very political in nature when you have tribal governments versus village corporations versus regional corporations, or buttressing up next to, the Forest Service or National Park or, wilderness refuge areas. And, what I guess as a perspective from an Alaska Native, growing up in Bethel, feeling like the land was always there and always provided, it gets even more complicated when I guess you grow up and you become aware of, how the economies of scale really uphold our state government, our legislators. And so I just thought I would just add that perspective as I think a really grounding principle for, just to sort of balance the scale, if you will, because it's complicated when, on behalf of the Bureau of Land Management, we're one of the few DOI agencies that really look at the multiple use provisions, which include, mining efforts, oil and gas extraction, grazing rights, hunting and guiding, permitting in certain areas of the state. And I just thought I'd add that for my 2 cents. So thank you. Great job, Freddie.
I so appreciate that, Donna, and I just very much appreciate seeing you sitting in front of a BLM sign as well, and everyone working inside and outside of these systems. But that we just love dichotomy, don't we, as human beings? And, here, Alaska and Canada, that's so arbitrary. The border is arbitrary. And that's why we're here together. And this love to feed on this dichotomy of tribes versus corporations, development versus conservation, and really blowing that out of the water to really think about the future. And that is why I just love young leaders like Freddie, who don't want to conform to these dichotomies, this X or Y, black or white, that people love to feed on. And so I really appreciate you bringing that into the room, Donna. I don't know if that's what you were saying, but that's what I was hearing. And we always really aim to do that as well in our work, because it's so, we see that happening through many processes across the state. And really want to bring in all of relatives and brothers and sisters. This border is also so arbitrary, just like corporations and even federally recognized tribes. That's a federally recognized system as well. We do have IRAs. I won't go into that. You can all take a tribal governance class, but same with the boundaries. So thank you. I see Ralph there. I don't know if he had a comment or question to share, but thankful for all of our Southeast partners that are on as well.
I just think I can appreciate what you just said very much, Carrie. A lot of the work we do now has to focus on that separation that's been created and those walls and barriers that have been put up in the many different organizations, whether it's federal or within communities, right? Communities are putting up their own barriers to exactly that, what are we looking for the future is the big question now. And like, there's a group of people and leaders coming through and change in the federal government, hopefully, that we could see through. That is absolutely getting to that question. And that's like, we have to stop siloing ourselves and stop putting ourselves away from each other and giving the power away. Our job is to take the power back. And I think that's what really got me interested in this class and the perspective I knew you'd bring there. So thanks, Donna, and thanks, Carrie, for bringing that here.
Basit, Ralph, I love all of the work that you're doing in Southeast to break down those boundaries and borders and work across everything from tribes to corporations to conservationists to economic development all in one. And that's really a good segue into our breakout group dialogue question. So I've just put it in the chat as best I can. And remember, this is impetus for your dialogue. Don't feel bound in. And if you have something you're really wanting to share with your group, and I'll try to put it back in the groups, but if you want to cut and paste or take a picture of that, knowing the multitude of diverse interests, landowners, and management policies, how do we move forward more holistic planning methods based on Indigenous worldviews, the people of this place, considering all of the external impacts and driving forces as well, such as an arbitrary border and climate change? And so that's a very different answer coming from somebody who works for the federal government or the state government or somebody who works for a corporation or a tribe. And so that is really the beauty of the breakout groups. And I just really want to remind everybody to introduce yourselves when you start sharing, to create an atmosphere of respect and safety. We may not all agree, but that helps move us forward to solutions. And just allowing space for everyone to talk and share. Liana or Hannah Marie, did I miss anything before we send them off? It's 3:03, and I'd like for you to share for until 3:40, so we can come back and have about 20 minutes for people to share. Maybe assign someone in your group. We're going to have 13 rooms today, so they're smaller, to share at least one tidbit, like 1 minute tidbit from your group, okay? Breaking down the silos, breaking down the dichotomies. That's what we're getting after today, while grounding yourself in Indigenous worldviews that we heard on Tuesday. Anything I missed there, ladies? Okay. How do we begin to heal those divides? So Hannah is going to send us to our breakout rooms, and I want to thank Freddie so much for leading us in this direction, and Donna and Ralph breaking down these silos and barriers. So I think everybody's getting their invitations now, Hannah, to join their breakout groups.
What time are we coming back all together, Carrie?
3:40, 3:45, somewhere in there. I think just about everyone is back with us. I think all the rooms were closed, and our group has gotten a bit smaller as we round out our time together today. I hope that everyone was having really productive conversations in your breakout groups and enjoying all the diversity that we are in our time together here. So I would just love for folks to, if you can, if you use your reaction feature, you can raise your hand, and it just allows us to step over each other a bit less. But we do have 17 minutes and would love to hear some of the key gems. And also if you can share in the chat some of those key gems and takeaways from your time together. Thank you, Sean. I see you.
Thanks, Carrie. We talked a lot about the frameworks that are used, the assumptions behind those frameworks. There was some discussion about whether it's even worthwhile to talk about shoehorning in Indigenous worldviews into a framework that was created wholly out of Western worldviews, if that's even something that's possible to do in an effective way. And we talked about this idea of like assuming people's motivations, how a lot of the legislation is based on this idea that the only motivation people might have is this money. It's all about the money and the money, whereas sort of it feels like that collapses people down into something a lot less complicated than people are, that people have values and they have norms and cultural beliefs and a whole rich history, and that this particular framework maybe doesn't suit the more complicated nature of people and how people interact with the spaces that they exist in.
You guys went for it. I love it. I love it. I love digging deep and really having some deep consideration. I see you, Kristen.
Hi. We talked about language being kind of the very first step toward healing that divide and toward building a more holistic planning process, if that's even the right word to use. And we talked about translation services and success stories using translation to ensure that planning presentations are coming across appropriately and respectfully and meaningfully. And there was a story in our group about a presentation not being vetted by translators and it going terribly awry. And then we talked about incorporating traditional knowledge of landscapes and place names in the form of having a local guide, assist in different mapping projects for plans. So language and, using the right place names and using the right, we weren't sure, like we talked about having translator services, but we also talked about having agencies send their staff to language classes as well, like making sure that it went both ways.
Bossy, appreciate it, Kristen. I see your hands clapping there, and also really bringing in some of the words of Wilson from Tuesday. I see you, Nikita. Did I get it right, Nikita?
Yeah, you did. In our group, well, the first part that we mostly talked about was that this conversation is finally being talked about, because long ago it was not allowed to talk about. And then we kind of changed to moving forward is by everyone talking, and how the history and knowing the knowledge and having the support of everyone, like as of this class. And then we just mostly went to how Alaska's history is recent. And then we went into mining, and then we went to private land, and into some conversations of the habitat restoration. And then a group member was talking about how the best of the people is the end result, So how this ends of what we're gonna get in this class is mostly how we can move forward towards the Indigenous worldviews. Sorry. That's it. That's all that I got. There was a lot that was talked about.
Yes, love it. Right on. We are doing the work just by being here and having this dialogue and these discussions. We are moving the needle and moving it forward. Wonderful. Okay, I'm looking for more hands out there. Anna, I see you, Anna.
I couldn't see if there was if you could raise your hand reaction. I don't have that one. Anyway. So we talked about, I would say, Josh talked about the disconnect between like within the village and the traditional ways of sort of governing, and the disconnection between council, or within the Canadian context, the governments and their citizens, and how that imposition or the placement of a structure or governance structure that doesn't reflect the needs or the reality of citizens and people who live there and the environment, actually. So that part, I think, is a challenging one, because I would say even within the Kirkcaldy First Nation, they are clan-based, but there's still a tension that occurs and creates a lot of stress, I think, trying to fit a round peg in a square hole type of thing. And I guess from the work that we're doing with How We Walk with Land and Water is the two sort of main tenets that we're trying to propel forward is our process in terms of how do we walk with the land and the animals in the water, and not on it. And that reflects like how we talk about what we're doing, what we are, the language that we utilize around engagement, but because the how we talk sort of, it frames our thinking and guides our actions, and the process, I think, is one of the more difficult things for other bodies or groups or governments to implement. And as from the reading clearly stated, is that we have all this knowledge, but implementing it is seemingly a very difficult task. And I do see it even in our processes, even internally, and the elders often say, we've said this to you once, we've said this to you, why aren't you listening to us? Why aren't you listening? And because they're repeating what they're saying, and it just seems to go over people's heads. But so we're struggling to, how do you articulate so people understand how important the process and how we do things is. We're changing our sort of way of being in a way, and not in huge ways, but in small ways, like involving young people and elders together so that the transfer of knowledge is occurring. That is a small step, but a big one. Ceremony in practice, and recognizing the spiritual to be discussed and a part of conversation and ceremony. So the process is a big part of it, and I think it's a good question as to how do you help people implement it into their structures, or do you yeah, how we walk with land and water is not going to try to fit in too much, I hope. I don't think. Anyway, that's kind of what we were talking about.
Basi, a lot to consider there as far as language again. Those small steps we take, including elders and youth, we talk about it all the time. Do we take these small, easy steps? So I see Alyssa and then Sheila. Thank you, Anna.
Hello. Our group, we spoke about, I guess we started off talking about how to incorporate original, like indigenous methods of, for example, like salmon spawning. And that was really interesting. And how to incorporate basically the indigenous ways into everything we do. There was also talk about incorporating language and how can we do this. And we got into talking actually about a project that the city of Kasan is working on Prince of Wales Island, and we don't have any street signs. And so how people are gathering together and making those changes and basically acknowledging and coming from a place of respect. And I made some notes so I wouldn't forget. Basically recognizing indigenous people to their place, and that we need to know that basically the boundaries, we can't always follow those, and decisions made in an example of like the Haida Gwaii, there's people who are in Canada, and we need to consider that if the US is making decisions, and basically bring people back to the table into their rightful place, and making sure that they're not just involved in the land planning, but in everything. So that I would say that pretty much covers mostly what we talked about in our group.
I just love these dialogues and all of the sharing. I stay out of them because I feel you hear and see too much of me and I'll impact them. So I keep to myself, and I just love this sharing. Sheila?
Hi, I had to find my buttons. I work on Teams part of the time and I work on Zoom part of the time, and the buttons are in different places. We talked a little bit about the LCCs, and like the Northwest Boreal LCC that the Yukon Flats was part of, and how that had brought us together, and trying to cooperate tribal interests and conservation interests and agency interests and pulling, research interests. It was a pretty holistic view of things. And I really liked what Atna area had done as far as coming together and doing their own land management regardless of the boundaries. That as an agency, how much easier that would make it to do land management if they came forward with an entire plan, regardless of the boundaries. Their plan, it's actually a starting place. It was proposed that the agencies should be able to get together and do this, but the agencies are all governed by Washington, D.C., and making anything happen in Washington, D.C. is next to impossible. That I don't see how you can work around that. I mean, the LCCs were a big step forward, and we put quite a bit of money into it, but you change administrations and it's gone. And I know part of the problem that Native people have, I've worked for the Yukon Flats for 20 years. My supervisor has been there the whole time, but the refuge manager, I've had 4 different refuge managers. So every time they kind of get used to what one refuge manager is doing, he's gone, and they're essentially trying to retrain another refuge manager. But the biggest thing I can see towards breaking down boundaries and stuff like that was an exercise that I did in a training called Open Standards. It was put on by the Nature Conservancy. And they actually separated the 2 groups, and they had us write our values on little sticky notes and put them under different topics of headings. And they suggested you do it in like 2 different rooms. And then once you've done that, switch rooms and really get to know each other, because I don't think our values are that different. I think we have a hard time talking to each other. And my experience working with Native people, both in Alaska and in North Dakota, is that trust is built one individual at a time. And until you give yourself to them so they know who you are, it's not going to exist. That you have to let people know who you are, and that's something that agency people don't generally do. You're representing the agency, you're not representing yourself, so you don't let your person out. And that makes it hard for people in the villages to even trust you, because they don't know who you are. And they don't know who you're coming from. And like cultural differences, as far as big one is like, I mean, Zoom's kind of made it all irrelevant. But when we would go to Standing Rock for a meeting, they always fed us first. If they would come to the agency office for a meeting, if we were going to feed them, we had to buy food out of our individual pockets, because the government wouldn't let you spend money on that. It was prohibited. And so sometimes there might have been food and other times there wouldn't been food. But I think the whole basis of it is that if you sit down and eat together before you discuss business, you start building trust. And we don't eat together. And until we start eating together and talking together and listening to each other as individuals, I don't think building trust is possible. And some of that's just my own opinion. It wasn't necessarily all discussed, but we kind of circled around the gist of how the agencies are kind of locked into what they are, just because Washington is what it is. And then people's opinions on, we were in a group that was mostly non-native talking, and that some of us found it a little bit hurtful to be lumped into the kind of the us versus them perspective. But the perspective that's being presented the last few days is the perspective of people and how they've been treated by agencies in history and the whole 9 yards. And until we get to know each other individually, that won't change. There's only that's the only fix is we need to talk to each other. And I would have to say in the last 2.5 years, communication has become almost non-existent with the villages with COVID. We used to do outreach camps with the kids and have an open house in one of the villages every year and stuff like that. And that's just stopped. And it's become much harder for us to work together because we're not talking together. We're not eating together.
Thank you, Sheila. Really appreciate your depth of your comments there. And I just want to honor everyone's time. I know it's past 4 and we've a lot of people have fallen off. I know a lot of people have obligations in our Western lives and our Western systems, and we're cramming a lot into our 2.5 hours together. We've spent 5 hours together this week. So I just really want to honor your comments and everyone's comments today and everyone's time. And I do love Sheila's words that we need to eat together. And it does feel like it's very hard during COVID, and is always a never-ending challenge that we have to build trust and to work, as we see many comments, human to human in the work. And recognize that we're discussing systems and not individuals, I think is always something, a good reflection as well. But with that, and in honoring of all of your time, I just want to say that we won't meet next week. We're meeting every other week. And so just really encourage you, Hannah Marie, we're going to have the chats in the Google Drive, resources in the Google Drive, and a place for you to also dump resources, look at extra resources, and, you know, however much time all of us commit different amounts of times to these efforts to dig into other materials and resources and share other materials and resources. So I'm really looking forward to next week. We're starting both with Coralie and Mary Peltola, or excuse me, the week after next, Canadian and Alaskan perspectives we'll have in our next time together. So I just want to say, Anabasi, for sharing your time with us, for having this dialogue and honor your time and wrap us up there. But as Sheila said, I wish we were all sharing a meal together. And last but not least, just a huge amount of gratitude to Freddie, not only for his presentation and his work today, but what he represents in his life and his path, and even in his Zoom profile pic, that this is a multi-generational effort, and this is multi-generational work. So Anabasi, Freddie, for your work, your life, your sharing, and your time with us. It was really an excellent framing. And I just want to say we all honor and appreciate you, and also being on the guiding Indigenous committee for this whole effort as well. Freddie's been a guiding voice in all of this. So want to thank Freddie as we close out. Okay, Anabasi, everyone. I hate to throw us off there, but I do want to honor everybody's time today, and we'll see you in a week and a half. Okay, and you'll be getting emails from Hannah Marie.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Masi.